Welcome to today's presentation of college readiness and student success for students with learning disabilities or who are neurodiverse. And of course, students are welcome to learn from this presentation as well. Let me introduce you to our guest speaker. Dr. Marci Schwartz is the founder of Thrive College Counseling in Los Gatos, where she works with students with unique learning profiles. She guides students in understanding the differences between high school and college and the college readiness skills needed for a successful transition to college. She also provides support in locating the best college fit to meet their educational and social emotional needs. She is an adjunct clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. So welcome, Marci. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Glad to be here, and I will go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Hi, so just want to add one piece to this is that this talk is going to be focusing on specifically readiness skills. So it's kind of taking a deeper dive into 3 skills in particular that we're going to go over. So last week I did a different webinar that's focused more on the college application process, and that covered more details. So if that's those are the questions that you have, you might want to reference that previous talk from last week. I'm sure that we can get you access to that. So this is going to be a little bit different and just kind of diving in a little bit deeper into the skills. So we're going to be covering what does it mean to be college ready? And in the 3 areas that I'm going to focus on, there's obviously more than 3, but these are 3 that I really want to spend some time talking about, and that's self-determination, self-advocacy, and disclosure. So we are going to launch right in. So what does it mean to be college ready? So it's very important when families are thinking about college that it's not about a specific, like a set number of skills that a person should have. It needs to be individualized for each particular student. So the things that we're going to be talking about, these are things that all students could be and should be working on, but the degree of success in achieving these different areas and understanding and being able to implement things like self-advocacy, that needs to be matched with where the student is at and also the college setting that they're going to be in. So there's a variety of factors regarding college readiness, and it's important to keep that in mind that it needs to be very individualized and really looking at the student's strengths and the students' challenges and seeing how they are coming together as the student moves through high school and gets ready to consider the different aspects of what is expected in college and how are those strengths serving the students and what are the challenges that the student is facing around college readiness and what are the things and resources that a student can access. But a main piece is the student's ability to understand their specific needs and their willingness to access to the support they need in order for them to be the best student they can be. So that's a basic tenet that I use in working with students as we in high school, as we look to what's coming in college and that transition and helping the student be able to achieve that skill of understanding their needs and their willingness to access that support. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is going to be self-determination. But in order to do that, I want to go over a couple of student examples that I've just created. So I'm going to read them to you, whoopsie, so that I can see that I'm moving it. So Sally is a senior in high school who has an IEP that includes a study skills class. She has significant learning challenges that have made high school very difficult for her. She is tutoring most days after school to help her process and integrate what she is learning. She takes fewer classes than her peers, so she will not be overwhelmed with the amount of work she has to do. She has taken summer classes each summer to keep up with her credits. She is aware of her learning challenges and independently manages her tutoring schedule and will ask for additional meetings as needed. She has maintained a 3.3 GPA. So that's Sally. Now let's look at, can't get my next one, at Carol. So Carol is a high school senior who has no IEP or 504. She has a 4.2 GPA and has taken many AP classes. She does not typically need to study for tests and does well nevertheless. She will often complete assignments at the last minute. She struggles with friendships and her relationship with her family is challenging as she will get angry and yell when things don't go her way. She is not open to seeing a therapist or talking with her family. She is happy engaging with her robotics team and they have recently won a regional competition. So I'm going to be referencing Sally and Carol, and I might actually go back to those things, to those slides so you can see them. So, and this is the last slide I'm going to read to you. This is actually really not a reading, a talk where I'm going to be reading every slide, but I just want to get through these main pieces. So there is a Vanderbilt Kennedy Center has done, I think, a really great job in putting out information about self-determination. And that's where a bunch of the information that I'm going to be going through is coming from. And I'm happy to share that resource with you. I think it's a wonderful resource for families to have, and it really breaks things down into bite-sized pieces that families can use to work on with their children. But this talk is really just going to give you an overview of what self-determination is and the importance of it and how to understand it. So self-determination can be defined as the act of making up one's own mind about what to think or what to do. Self-determination covers many different aspects of life, such as planning and decision-making. So self-determination is not just about academics, but it's about all areas of a person's life. People with more self-determination report that they are more satisfied with their lives. Children and teens who are taught self-determination skills do better in school and are more organized and self-directed. And I have seen this in my work. When I am able to work with students that have or are building or understand the importance of self-determination, there is a greater sense of ownership over what they need to do and what they want for their future. And it's coming from the student, as opposed to a teacher or a parent or society saying, you must go to college, you must do these things. When those things, when the goals come from the student, there is a qualitatively different experience in the students, in my opinion, their ability to go through the steps they need to achieve their goals. And that's what we want our students to do, is to be able to achieve their goals in life, to have the education, the independence, the life experience that they want to have. And so that's why self-determination is such an important skill for us to go over. So for children, the adults typically manage and direct their different aspects of their development. And we expect that to transition to more into the control of the young adult and the adult, and that they are able to manage and direct these different areas, their emotions and education, et cetera. So we're just going to take education and career goals, since that's, transition to college is what the theme of this is, and maybe talk about the two examples that I had spoken of earlier and read through. And you can see that the student that has a lower GPA, very specific learning challenges, has an IEP, is getting support, really is struggling actually to take a full course load in high school, let alone in college. But that student, when you read the little vignette, there's a sense of ownership. The student accesses their tutors, they're open to the process, they recognize when they need more help and they will seek it out. And they're open to the accommodations that they are getting. And if those are not happening, they will seek them out. And that is a student who, in my mind, they have that self-determination skill, is that they've determined that they would like to do well academically in high school, and they are taking those steps that they need to achieve that, and they're doing it independently. There are some families where the parents or the tutors kind of rally around the student to tell them what they need to do, and they get through. And so that's when I'm working with families, I will also often ask when a student is working with their tutor, who sets the agenda for that tutoring session? Is it the student who's saying, I had a hard time understanding math today, can you help me with that? Or is the tutor pulling out the student's information, organizing it and saying, it looks like you had trouble with this, let's go over it. And that is a great example of self-determination and a great opportunity actually for those who are not doing it, for the tutors to, or the parents or whoever is working with the student to recognize that it's important that the students start to be able to recognize where they need help, and then understand that and how to ask for that help. And we'll talk more about self-advocacy, but it's when it comes from the student and their desire to learn or to reach a goal, that is the self-determination piece. And that's the part that is a wonderful skill to have when a student is transitioning and is in college. And also these skills, none of them that we're going to talk about, they don't develop overnight. These are all, when I'm talking about these, are processes that take years, but high school is a great time to start. And it's not that we expect them all to be set and in stone and fully developed by the end of high school, but this is the time to really increase our students' awareness of the importance of these skills, because it helps us think a little bit differently, like my tutoring example. Maybe we can support the student in building self-determination by changing up what the tutoring session is like and who starts it, and guiding the student in building that. So that's self-determination from that viewpoint. And we could just go through. So this is an example from the Vanderbilt toolkit. So it's just very concrete. So I left it there because it's easy to understand about steps a person can take in building their self-determination skills. But I thought we can also just put in some goals that a person who's looking for a college education might want to put in here. So a specific goal might be go to college. Measurable would be get accepted to college or apply to a certain number of schools. Action-oriented would be something along the lines of steps that they need to take, whether it's taking the SAT or figuring out, working on building up their GPA or researching schools. So there's action steps that the student, once they're educated about what steps they can take and should take, are they adding those to that goal? And then being very realistic about the colleges that a student is applying to, the number of colleges, because there's a lot of work in applying. And then setting timeframes are very important around this process of in achieving the goal. If you don't make the deadline for submitting your application, that can be a problem. So there's all of these elements to consider when breaking it down, so a student can have access to opportunities of building their self-determination. And there's different pieces to consider when you're looking at the self-determination. And sometimes one of the things that comes up is unrealistic expectations. And that is very common in the work that I do in guiding students through their college list. And oftentimes, as we call them, reach schools, that there are students who decide to apply to a college or more than one that is unrealistic, or they have a goal career-wise that may be incredibly demanding of their academic abilities, and they may not be able to manage that. And with self-determination, it's not about saying a goal isn't realistic, but it's breaking it down and helping the student understand the steps that they need in order to achieve that goal. And the work that I do with the college list when this comes up is that many students, well, a decent number of them, a lot of people like to apply to Stanford and some other high profile schools like that. And I can, depending on the GPA and the student and my experience, you can really tell how realistic or unrealistic this is. And I will I will guide the families in helping them have a realistic list, in that they have to have other options that they have more likely chance of getting into. But students should have some unrealistic applications on there if they want them, because it's not for me to say no, but it's for me to help the student understand the pros and the cons of that list, of those schools, and is it a match for their learning needs. And so it's not whether or not a goal is realistic, it's helping the student work through it. And sometimes we just need to sit with unrealistic goals, as long as there's a guiding piece and the student is able to build their self-determination because they're seeing the steps that they need to take in order to reach that goal. And then it all seems to kind of work itself out, and the student has a sense of understanding. And usually by the time the students are seniors with that often high number of people from our area that apply to Stanford, they are not they understand, and it's evolved for them, and it's evolved for them in a very affirming way. And some of that comes from their peers, some of it is the process, some of it is the maturity, but you can see the self-determination in the students as they go through this process. So that's just, I think, an important thing to talk about, realistic versus unrealistic goals. It's not a problem if they're unrealistic, it's how we work with them. So I know I just talked a lot because self-determination is a big, and there's so much more to say about it, but I just wanted to introduce that topic and just share the importance of that. And I think that families might get a benefit from that resource that I can also send. Okay, so I'll assume that Diana is going to let me know if there's any urgent questions from that piece, but otherwise I'm going to talk more about self-advocacy, or start to talk about self-advocacy.
Okay. And Marci, I just want to tell everybody that I'm putting in some links to some resources regarding self-determination, and if you have any, I'll be happy to send them in the email. So we'll definitely be sending out some resources regarding this material. So,
awesome. That's perfect, because I think it's really important and helpful information for families in this process. Okay, so self-advocacy is, to me, it's more commonly talked about than the self-determination piece, and it kind of is self-advocacy, I believe, is a part of the self-determination piece, but it's really the ability for a student to articulate their needs and make informed decisions about what they need in various domains. And so when a student is able to advocate for their needs in academically, and they're a good self-advocate, they can go to the teacher and ask questions, but they may not be good self-advocates socially. And that's something to be addressed and to be aware of. And so looking at self-advocacy, it is important to look at it by domain. I work with a lot of families who will say, oh, my child's able to self-advocate, they are able to talk with the teacher, but it's the other aspects of self-advocacy that are important, particularly around social, because that's where I sometimes worry about students if they will not speak up and they are having trouble. I worry about the vulnerability of that student and wanting to make sure that if something is not right, that they will know to seek help and talk to somebody. And that's something that I think that social self-advocacy, knowing that they can go to a resident assistant or calling a parent at least, and then get guidance that way, I think is really an important skill. So it's that interpersonal piece, the medical piece. When a student is in college, a question that I'll often ask is, does the student know when they don't feel well and know what to do? Because it's oftentimes us parents who notice that our kids aren't feeling well, and we kind of step in, but are they able to understand that, recognize self-awareness of recognizing it, and then advocate for those needs? And those are, when we're sending our children off to live in dorms, these are really important skills. Questions to ask are, can the student consistently and in a timely way identify when they need help? And so what I will often hear is that the student might ask for help on an academic project like 2 days before it's due. That's not awesome. And so they are advocating, so it's great that they have that skill. But if they're not able to do it in a timely way, they may not get the support that they need, and then that might impact their grade and their academics, and that can be hard emotionally on a student. And the same thing with social and other areas, to be able to advocate and to speak up when something is not right. I have found that when students sit with things and they're not sure about them, they tend to get oftentimes anxious. They're worrying about it. They're not sure what to do, and it's stuck in them, and they don't recognize necessarily the importance of advocating and talking to somebody. So those are important things around the time of things. And the ability to communicate their need to the appropriate person, that's another piece. I know that there's social anxiety and other areas that impact a student's comfort level in walking up to somebody and getting help and advocating for their needs. So those are all areas to be aware of and to build in high school. Considering the role of self-awareness plays it's a very important part of the ability to self-advocate, because if you're not aware of what it is that you need, it's hard to step in and self-advocate. And so this is something where families and teachers can really be supportive in teaching a student. So helping a student build their self-awareness, like if somebody is struggling with something, and asking them, instead of, you seem anxious or scared, how do you feel? And then you ask instead, how do you feel? And try to help guide the student to come up with their response on their own, and then asking more questions like, well, what do you think you should do? And that's building not only the ability to work towards self-advocacy, but it's also the self-determination. What do you think you should do about this? What would you like to see happen? Is a way to create a goal for a student. I would like to do better in math. Okay, what do you think would be helpful? I think a tutor would be helpful. Okay, that sounds great. Do you think I should get a tutor for you? Yes. So that's incorporating the student into the conversation, building their self-advocacy and self-determination. What I see most often is that the adults will identify a challenge and put in the resources, and the student follows along, and it's very helpful for the student. But this is just a different way of looking at this to build these skills that the student really could benefit from when in college. And keeping in mind that self-awareness and self-advocacy do evolve over time, and that having them being ongoing conversations is really helpful. I want to say, go ahead, Diana.
Yeah, and is there a best practice age to start teaching and coaching the self-advocacy skills or self-awareness skills?
Yes, I would say middle school is great, but that's really a time to just your teaching, right? Like asking those prompting questions, as opposed to having the student feel like they just need to know this, and also gauging with the student how aware they are. Middle school is still kind of young, and they may not recognize that they're feeling anxious or that they're struggling with something until a parent points it out. So parents can then say, this is what I've noticed. Is that right? Tell me what you think. So if the parent can initiate the conversation and point it out as something important to talk about, let the student know that the parent's a listener and a helper and a guide. But it's really, they're there to guide the student. Those are all really helpful things to do in middle school and then going forward.
That's great. Thanks for clarifying that. Yes, some families were just wondering how early should we start? Is 7 years old too early? So
yeah. You can, if it's developmentally appropriate, guiding a student at 7 is fine, but you just want to make sure that, when they're young like that, they're really turning to their parents as their guide. And that's how they're learning about themselves, by reflecting in what the parent is doing. And so starting too early and pushing too much independence on them you kind of want to have that balance.
Mm-hmm. And then on a related note, what if the student themselves feels like, well, nothing will happen or change if I speak up. Nothing will happen or change if I disclose. What can you say to a child who has that in their mind?
That nothing's going to make it better, right? Like if I advocate for myself, they're not going to listen and it's not going to go anywhere. Yeah. So
Yeah, that and the disclosure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we can definitely talk about the disclosure, but just in general about the advocating and is this going to be a helpful thing? And that's where the parents can really be super supportive in guiding the student. Student might ask for something from a teacher and advocating and it's not working out. And those conversations that the parents can have about why did it not work out, and then problem solving with them. Well, what other avenues can we take, or what do we think happened that it didn't work out? Was it a clear communication? Is this something that the teacher's even allowed to do? And like looking at it from all different angles, and then reaching out to the high school and a case manager, an IEP team, somebody that can clarify why the student is not receiving what they were asking for. Because I think knowledge would be the next step of understanding why this is not working. And then once you have that knowledge, that's when you can go back and say, wait a minute, I still have this need despite, this answer that I received about what's not working on the school side. And that's where, contacting other members of the school and even parents helping parents who are wonderful advocates to help clarify when there is a miscommunication or misunderstanding or things aren't going as they should. And actually, it's really wonderful for parents to model. I mean, I don't expect the student to contact parents helping parents, but for the student to see the parents saying, hey, this is something that needs tending to. And so I'm going to contact these people. And then for the parent to keep the student informed, what did they learn? And also, not everything works out the way we wanted to, but that doesn't mean we don't try, and doesn't mean we don't advocate. But that modeling is just so important. Does that answer the question, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Marci.
Yeah, and disclosure is a little bit more fraught with things, so we can talk about that as well in a minute. Here we go. So a lot of these things will be coming together because the self-determination is like this bigger umbrella of it's a way of doing and taking ownership over what the student wants to do with their life, their goals, what's important to them. The self-awareness and the self-advocacy is their ability to move forward with those, advocating if the goal is to do better in math or do better on an SAT, then they need to be aware of that, advocate for that in a way that's timely and is able to connect with the students' goals. Disclosure is related as well, but it also, in my mind, has its own little life form. So disclosure actually goes over many years, and I'm sure there's parents and students listening, and the first piece of disclosure really comes from the parents when if a child is diagnosed with a disability or a challenge, it's typically the parent that knows first, and it's usually a child who's young, not an adult. And so it's really up to the parents to figure out, do they want to disclose the diagnosis to the child? Do they disclose to extended family, friends? And this is very tricky. It's very unique for every family. There's cultural implications for it. There's the extended family and their viewpoint on disclosure or learning about a disability. There's the issue of stigma and stigma that might be happening in a family around a disability that the parents are all taking into account. And it's also the parents and how they understand the challenge that the student is having. So, and the diagnosis that they have. So disclosure, before we even talk about the student disclosing in college, it's important to, I think, recognize what a wide issue this is. And it really touches so many elements. It's really not just about the student. But as the student ages and knows about their disability, then there's the issue of the students disclosing to peers. And some students are all about it. They're starting neurodiversity groups and they talk about their autism or neurodiversity or ADHD or dyslexia, and they are very open about it and feel very comfortable about it. And then there's other students who just don't. And then there's everywhere in between, and there's no right or wrong way to handle that. It's really for the student to feel comfortable sharing it with others. It is the student's disability is theirs to share. It's theirs to disclose. And for young adults and adults, disclosing in college settings and in work settings, that's another area, right? That's different than disclosing to peers. And it's really important to consider who you're disclosing to, why you're disclosing it, what's the goal of disclosure? What exactly are you going to disclose? Where are you going to make that disclosure? And when? And so we can use the College Disability Office as an example. So if a student, say, is neurodiverse, has autism, and they get extended time on tests, and they get a note taker, for example, and they have a report that indicates those resources, the student, with the help of the parent, needs to, once they decide what college they're going to go to, they submit that report to the disability office at a college, and it's kept confidential there. The disability office will then determine the specific skill accommodations that a student qualifies for based on what the student was getting in high school, an IEP, a report, and then they will send the student a letter basically saying that the student gets extended time on tests and tests in a quiet room, whatever it is. And that letter is typically good for multiple years when the student is in college, and it does not say why. And then that letter belongs to the student, and then the student, for every class that they take in college, they will email that to a professor and say, I have the accommodation, I take a test in a quiet room, and so just letting you know. And now the teacher knows, but the teacher does not know why, and they don't ask. And so then the student just needs to advocate for themselves in going to the quiet room for the test, and then we need to advocate, they could just go do it. If the professor says, oh, but you're fine, you could take it here, that's when the student needs to advocate and make sure that they are getting the accommodations that they need, and the disability offices are there to advocate. So the disclosure is really to the disability office regarding, they're the only ones who actually know that the student in my example has autism. Nobody else is going to know that unless the student decides to share that. But that student who's living in a dorm might have sound sensitivities, and they're concerned about their roommate playing loud music. So that may be another opportunity to disclose and to talk with the roommate about it, but they don't necessarily have to say why, but they can just explain that. Some students will disclose more fully, say, to a resident assistant in case they need additional support and guidance while living in the dorm. It's kind of nice to have that RA actually know more, but that is up to the student. And so you can see that there's all of these opportunities for disclosure for different reasons. And that is why I think it's an important topic for students to consider, why they're disclosing, to what end, and where is their confidentiality, and how comfortable do they feel about it. So as it pertains to neurodiversity, disclosures when an individual decides to share information regarding their strengths and challenges, their diagnosis, or other information regarding their neurodiversity. So as I was saying, the individual determines what they disclose and to whom. There are in the work that I do, I strongly recommend that students have people that they feel really comfortable talking to about this, because there are oftentimes really good reasons to disclose when a student can benefit from that disclosure, like disclosing to the disability office at a university so that they can get the academic and other supports that they need to be their best student. And to not disclose and receive those services, I don't know that that's always in the best interest of the student. I hear a decent amount from students leaving high school with an IEP saying, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to start fresh. I don't want anyone to know. I just want to go and start college without any of this encumbrance that I had with the IEP. And that's where I think that this concept of disclosure, it's not so much to change the student's mind, but it's to have a dialogue about really what are we talking about here with disclosure? What will it look like? What can you gain? And what can you miss out on by not disclosing? So you can see how this really goes back to our self-determination a little bit of saying this, if a student's goal is to do well in high school, in college, what can they learn about disclosure and how that might advance their goals? It doesn't mean that they need to disclose everything to everybody, but I think there's subtleties in disclosure, and I think it's important for students to understand that and to have trusted people that they could talk to about that. So some pros and cons of disclosure and really thinking about it is that there's when you do disclose, there's an increased chance of that your needs are going to be understood and you're going to have accommodations provided. So obviously, if you don't send the information into the disability office, they're not going to get you the accommodations and you're just not going to have it. But then there are some downsides in other elements of disclosure, such as in a work setting. There's their confidentiality that isn't necessarily the same, particularly for an interview. You know, there's could be cases where a potential job, you disclose because you need a particular accommodation, and then you lose the interview because you disclosed. So that can happen. But there is so much wonderful work being done in neurodiversity at work and adding resources and education and tremendous amount of value that is seen in the workforce that is spreading across the world, actually. But the value of neurodiversity and what individuals with dyslexia can bring, and thinking outside of the box, and all of these wonderful skills that individuals have. So we're coming into a new way, I think, of looking at disability and how individuals with various strengths and challenges and various neurodiversities are embraced into the world of higher education and into the world of work. It's moving in a really positive direction. Is it perfect? No, but I think it's important that we're all aware of the importance of understanding disclosure and also the places that you're disclosing to. There's places like Microsoft where they're very, very open to working with individuals who are neurodiverse, and disclosing at an environment like that is probably very different than disclosing at maybe a different company that is not as far advanced in these areas. And so we just need to educate ourselves about where we're disclosing, as opposed to should I just not disclose. There are concerns around privacy and feeling stigmatized, and that is a very real concern for students, but it is very individualized. You can see that, we can line up two people with very similar challenges and strengths, and just the way they approach it, they don't feel a sense of stigma regarding their disability. They feel a sense of pride and ownership over their strengths and challenges. And so all of those pieces come together to really impact how a student views disclosure. And so I think these conversations with family, with maybe therapists, with, just having opportunities to discuss what is right for that student, what feels comfortable for that student based on their unique needs and their strengths and challenges and who they are and how they feel about it, and just having discussions so that the student over time can feel more comfortable negotiating with themselves. And as they go through their phases of life, high school, college, and the workforce and career and family, how do they manage disclosure throughout those different phases of life? And I think it's an important thing to consider and for families to talk about. So those are the three main points that I wanted to make about this. Are there questions, or how are we doing, Diana?
Yeah, there's one that's kind of related to what you were just talking about, and so I marked it as answered live, but also it's a very loosely worded question. What about if the student does not want to admit they need help? And I think you kind of scoop that up at the end right there with opening up dialogue with family, therapists, to help them kind of process right on their own. And like you mentioned, I like that phrase that they have to negotiate with themselves, right? They have that self-talk inside of their head that, and for some reason they have the emotional or intellectual, whatever barrier, that they need to process so that they can come to a place where they can feel comfortable disclosing. So is it ever advisable to pressure or force a child to disclose?
I would not, every child is different. So, there's no right or wrong answer that goes for everybody, but I would really encourage us, maybe some family therapy or family sessions to understand why is it so important for the parents that the child discloses, and why is it so important for the student that they not, and really making sure that there's clear communication and understanding almost with a third party about it, because it's important. We don't know what students hear from their peers. There are times where I've worked with an individual with autism and they've been talking with a bunch of their own friends who didn't know that they have autism, and they're saying negative things about people with autism, like other people, and say, oh, that person over there, they have autism, and saying negative and derogatory things. Like, now that student who was part of that conversation and nobody knows that they have autism, when we have a parent saying, you ought to share that, I just made that example. That has not really made up, but, I'm just bringing that up as an example about how we don't know what's going on for students that makes them resistant. And I feel like it's important to understand that resistance, because we don't know what they've heard and how they might feel about the disability based on information that may actually not be accurate or negative in some way.
Thank you. There's a question about, do you need to be retested after age 16 for the college to recognize a learning disability like dyslexia? Or do they commonly use testing from that's older than that, from age 15 or younger?
So every college is going to handle it differently. The main rule that I go by, that just, has been, but it is changing and evolving, and you can contact some potential colleges that you might be interested in and contact the disability office and ask them, or often it's on their website, but it's often at 16 and a half when there's some different testing that they will do. And that's going to be the most up to date. But there are some families who don't get that testing, and they just go with what the IEP has, and then they use the IEP as their documentation. I will say, though, that although the college might accept the IEP as the documentation, and basically the college will provide what the student was getting in high school, where students might lose out in that is that if there may be accommodations, like assistive technology is a great example of that may not have come up on the IEP, may not be something that the student was recommended, but really could benefit from in college. And if that's not documented, it's not going to be offered. Why would the disability office, who doesn't know this student, just throw in, maybe they would throw in some extra accommodations. The other thing about that I have seen is that there are other accommodations that just aren't part of high school. So sometimes they are, where you can get the slides, the PowerPoints from a professor in advance, so you can pre-learn for students who take longer to process, and that's an amazing resource and accommodation for students. But if that's not on the IEP and they don't have any updated testing to suggest that, that's something that the student might miss out on. So just, it's not a black and white answer. I'm sorry.
Right. Okay, I think that's about it for the questions now.
Awesome. So with just as a final couple of comments regarding the topics and the kind of going over the flow of the self-determination and then the self-advocacy and the disclosure, we can go back and look at these vignettes that we had. And so in this one, Sally is a very good self-advocate. She's very self-determined, and she's able to, at least from this example, advocate for what it is that she needs. And she seems to understand who she is as a student, and she's able to make use of the resources in her environment to be her best student. And those are great signs of college readiness, even though she is an IEP and all kinds of resources. This is a student that in working with, as long as she's in a learning environment that can meet her educational needs, she's very well on her way to going off to college. She has, to me, the fundamentals that she needs, and just to have them continue to be enhanced. Our second student, who has no IEP in 504, and I bring this up because I wanted a contrast to say that just the fact that a student has an IEP or a 504 does not mean that college doesn't have to be in their future, or that it impacts their college readiness or any of those things, or their GPA, frankly, because in this example, she doesn't have either of those, a IEP or a 504, and a very high GPA, and taking advanced classes, and is clearly gonna have interesting things to write, awards on her college application about robotics and competition. And so this student on paper can look really college capable, right? And academically, at least for the time being, may be so. But in the part where she doesn't need to study for tests and does well nevertheless, this is a student who's not really building study skills. And so at some point, the high school curriculum is obviously something that she can just listen to and regurgitate on a test and do well. In college, at some point, that skill is gonna tap out, and she's gonna need to study. And to go through all of those years of high school without really having to build study skills, and you can compare that to Sally, who has worked really hard on study skills, that it's going to be hard for Carol when it dawns on her in college that she does not have those skill sets to study, and she's not able to keep up with her peers, and that's going to be hard. In addition to that, in this example, when things don't go her way, it's a struggle for her, and she's not really willing to work on that. And so I see every year that I do the college admissions work that I do, that there's students in one form or another that they get into, or colleges that can serve them academically, but may not be a fit for their learning needs, or the student is academically capable but has not built up these other skills like self-determination and self-awareness. And the college admission process is not looking for these things, right? They're looking for the grades and the essays. They're not going to know if a student has the ability to self-advocate. It's just not part of what they look at. And so I want to end with emphasizing that so many people will look at college as getting accepted, to oftentimes the best school, as people will say. But that's just a piece of that. Did the student manage the things that the colleges look at in order to determine if a college will accept that student? But that is not looking at the things that a student needs to have success, necessarily living in a dorm. Like there's not an essay about that in the application process. Their ability to self-advocate, seek help when they need it. None of that is in necessarily the application, and admissions people won't know whether or not that's a skill that the student has. And so that's why I feel it's very important that there be more of a dialogue on those issues, because there'll be plenty of time for colleges to assess whether or not a student is going to be admitted to that school, but whether or not they are admitted to that school, can they be successful there, living in a dorm, taking advantage of all the college has to offer? And I really feel that's really what I'm trying to emphasize in this talk about college readiness, and look beyond the application and the GPA and all the other stuff, but it's those other skills that need to go into it in order for a student to be successful when away from home in college. I hope that was helpful. I don't know if there's any more questions or where we are with time.
Yeah, we have about 5 more minutes, and I know if some of you need to leave on time, please look for the survey that pops up as you exit the webinar and fill it out. It really helps us to keep our doors open and serve our communities better. So thank you for filling out that survey in advance. Yeah, we have some questions here. We'll just go through them from the top to down. What about testing for graduate school? When the student is 21? Many tests max at age 21.
Do you
something you're familiar with?
So
that might be something that you have to ask the specific therapist or the testing agency.
Right. But so there's, they mean like neuropsych tests. When they first started to say for graduate school, I was thinking like the GMATs, but that's not what they mean. Like they maybe mean getting assessed for extended time.
A neuropsych eval.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. There's definitely people who do that for individuals over 18. There's less people who do those neuropsych evals for adults than for kids, but they're definitely can be done. So if they want to email here, I have my email address. You could just email me and I can maybe give you some names.
Okay, great. Let's see. Is it recommended for a parent to ask for a 504 before leaving the high school if they have an IEP? If so, when might that be appropriate to make the transition smoother? So would you like me to address that one from an educational perspective? Yeah, and so any student who is already on an IEP is automatically covered under the 504 Civil Rights Protection Acts. So there's no need, and schools will know that, and they will not duplicate the paperwork. But if you're interested in ending the IEP and transitioning to 504 because your child no longer requires a special education related services, then that's something that you could have that conversation with the school district and discuss. So the 504 primarily focuses on a student who doesn't have as serious educational needs or therapeutic needs, and primarily relies just on accommodations that are more easily implemented directly in the classroom by the teacher, adjusting their environment, etc. So it's something you can bring up with your IEP team, but you will not duplicate the paperwork. And then let's see, so that's done. Do colleges accept 504s from a high school instead of IEPs to consider accommodations at college? I think you addressed this earlier.
Yeah, that you can just definitely submit your 504 and you can also reach out to the disability office at a couple of colleges and just let them know that that's your paperwork. Some of them will have on their website what they expect for documentation. There are some colleges that offer some comprehensive support programs that I think I talked about in last week's webinar, and those will often want more documentation, but so it's very individualized to the program, to the school, but worth following up so you know in advance and have time to get additional testing if needed.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to launch a poll because if there are any students or teens attending, this is a poll to see what they thought of the webinar today. So I'll just leave that up there on the side. Next question. Is there a college readiness competency a gap analysis assessment? College readiness competency gap analysis assessment. Is there such a thing?
It's a good question. There's not that I know of that I think what you're talking about, but there are some resources at college programs like Beacon College and Landmark College. They do some really great, they're virtual, some college readiness programming. So I can get you those links too to help a family better understand and look at what they need to do to work on.
Right, and if there isn't a one single test that scoops that up, there's likely multiple tests they can piece together to create a relevant assessment plan to meet the needs of the child based on the child's, learning situation and struggles. So, okay, great. Somebody says very useful presentation, so thank you. The assessments I've seen are at a category level and would miss a number of skills that a student needs. For example, having a methodology for taking notes that is efficient and create notes with value. Okay,
right.
Maybe that's just a comment. I think that's just a comment on her experience.
Yeah. But note-taking skills are very important, and they're the kinds of things that, there may be people at the high school or certainly tutors. Executive functioning tutors are really great at helping students really understand how to take notes, how to listen for the important pieces. And that obviously in college, there's the note taker as an accommodation, which really helps to make sure that the student has the full and accurate notes from the class so they don't miss anything.
Okay. All right. That's great. Yeah, and maybe consider asking for an AT assessment for any of those areas as well. Thank you. Are there any resources to develop study skills?
Yes.
There probably are. we could probably send some out. And I think if you look on our PHP website, you'll look in our e-learning section and our e-packets. Our e-packets have some very topic specific areas. I do believe we have a note-taking one. I think there is an executive functioning e-packet as well. Organization, mind maps, things like that. So take a look there. That might be an easy place to start. So on our PHP website, under our e-packets. Okay, great. And then is it recommended for a parent to ask for an updated evaluation before graduating for a student that is a senior and has an IEP?
So usually it goes by the triennial. So so if they had it in 10th grade, they may not qualify for it in 12th grade because it's every 3 years. But I think it's definitely worth asking the school to consider that. And particularly if the parent is considering a particular, assessment, or they're looking to identify a particular area of need that can be documented so the student will have those accommodations, it's definitely worth a conversation with the school.
Okay, great. Let's see if there are any last questions. I think we empty the Q&A, and I think I have some on the side. Ooh, let's see. Actually, I think we answered what are some resources or ways to teach children different self-determination skills. I did pop up like 3 links into the chats, and I will send those out in email as well. But Marci, did any pop into your mind that are on the top of your head?
About the self-determination. Well, I love this resource from the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. So I'll send you that, Diana, and then you can send that out because I think it's a really great resource.
Okay.